a sudden farewell, a haunting silence. Their last encounter unfolds with secrets, unspoken truths, and an ending that feels unfinished. The moment the glass door shut behind him, it was as if time paused. The soft click echoed far too loud for such a gentle sound. So, that's it? Jimin's voice trembled sharp but laced with disbelief as he stood frozen in the middle of the studio, his fingers still faintly shaking from the conversation that just occurred. Jungkook didn't turn around. The silence between them wasn't new, it had haunted them for weeks, but this silence felt different. He stood by the elevator, jaw tight, hands clenched into his hoodie. The air between them had grown thick, almost unbearable, like a storm just passed. But the damage hadn't yet been fully seen. Moments ago, that very studio had been a battlefield not of screams or physical outbursts, but of layered silences, stares that said too much, and half-sentences left suspended in the air. Jimin had shown up unannounced. He had waited for hours after hearing from someone that Jungkook might be alone at Hybe that night. The room had smelled faintly of coffee and amplifier dust. His voice was steady at first. "We need to talk." But Jungkook's expression had been unreadable. Not angry, not sad, just distant. Like someone halfway out the door before the first word was spoken. What followed wasn't shouting. It wasn't melodrama. It was worse. It was polite, detached, careful, as if every syllable might be their last. "I don't hate you," Jungkook had said simply, eyes lowered to the floor. But something changed. Maybe we did. Maybe you just didn't notice. Jimin's heart dropped, but his pride made him nod, as if he already knew. In truth, he didn't. He had seen the signs. Delayed replies, cancelled hangouts, awkward silences when Taehyung entered the room. But he told himself it was stress, timing, anything but this. The memory of Jungkook's hand flinching away when he reached for him just to fix his collar was still fresh. That hand used to hold his without needing a reason. Jimin's voice had cracked when he asked, "So, you're just walking away?" Jungkook had replied with a single breath, "I'm not walking. I already left. You just didn't see it." Now, the hum of the hallway lights seemed louder than ever. Jimin's knees threatened to give way. He wasn't the type to cry easily, not anymore. Not after everything they'd been through. But this wasn't heartbreak. This was a slow unraveling of something sacred. Something they had built quietly. Away from cameras, away from rumors. In stolen moments. In silent glances. In lyrics they pretended weren't written about each other. They had shared stages, rooms, flights, dreams. But somewhere along the line, the versions of themselves they loved had shifted, evolved, or maybe disappeared altogether. Jungkook looked back once. Just once. A glance so brief it could have been imagined. His eyes didn't hold rage, nor regret, just weariness. Jimin wanted to scream. He wanted to rush forward, to grab his wrist and ask why, to shake the answers out of him. But instead, he stayed still like a statue trapped in a moment that would replay in his memory forever. Even now, he couldn't decide which part hurt more, that Jungkook left, or that he did it without asking Jimin to come along. Hours passed before Jimin moved again. The studio was cold. The city outside had fallen asleep. On the desk, beside Jungkook's headphones, was a notebook. Jimin opened it not to invade privacy, but to find an explanation. A clue. A reason. But it was blank. No song, no words, just empty pages. Jimin closed it slowly, the weight of that emptiness hitting harder than any goodbye. He didn't call him. Jungkook didn't text. No cryptic posts. No rumors. Just silence. And that silence became a presence in itself louder than any song they had ever sung together. Fans started noticing. They speculated. Is something wrong? Why hasn't Jimin liked any of Jungkook's posts lately? Did they unfollow each other? Theories ran wild, but none of them knew that the truth was far less scandalous and far more devastating. Nothing happened. They just stopped being. Days turned into weeks. The schedules moved on. They smiled for cameras. They posted selfies. But those who looked close, really close, noticed something missing in their eyes. A certain brightness when the other was around. A hidden warmth. It was gone. Jimin sat in the practice room one night, the same place where they used to choreograph until their legs gave out. He remembered how Jungkook would toss him his water bottle without looking, how they would laugh uncontrollably over a missed step, how silence between them had once felt safe, not suffocating. He replayed that last interaction over and over, wondered if he had missed a signal, if he should have fought harder, or walked out first. But the truth was, sometimes people leave without doors slamming, without accusations. Sometimes they leave in fragments, in small choices, in quiet withdrawals, until one day you realize they're no longer there. And sometimes they don't come back. It wasn't a breakup. There were no promises made, no titles given. But the loss was real. Jimin eventually wrote again. This time not for release, just for himself. A song without chorus, just scattered lines, half finished. Like their story. He never sent it to Jungkook. He never would. But he hoped just maybe Jungkook would feel it. Somehow, somewhere. Because even if their last interaction left many questions, some things didn't need answers to be real. The rain had started just as Jimin stepped out of the building that night, soft and persistent, soaking through the fabric of his hoodie before he even reached the curb. Seoul's streetlights cast blurry halos in the downpour, mirroring the way his thoughts blurred everything he tried to focus on. Each step felt heavy, as though the concrete beneath him remembered Jungkook too, the paths they used to walk together, late at night, after practice, after music had stripped them raw. He didn't use an umbrella. He didn't even flinch. Maybe the cold would help numb everything inside. He didn't go home right away. His legs carried him toward the Han River instead, instinctively, as if the water could absorb his grief. That place had seen them laugh once. It had seen Jungkook's head on his shoulder, eyes closed, both of them silent, content. It had also seen them argue low voices, late hours, the tension between ambition and affection. Now it would see Jimin alone, asking questions he wasn't brave enough to say aloud. Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you try one more time? Somewhere in the dark, his phone buzzed. For a fleeting second, his breath caught. Hope clawed at his chest, irrational and wild. But it wasn't Jungkook, just a manager checking in. He didn't reply. He turned the phone off completely, shoving it deep into his pocket, like a secret too painful to face. The wind picked up, slicing across the river, and he sat on the bench that had once held both of them. Water clung to his eyelashes, his jaw trembling not from cold but from everything he had tried so hard to suppress. His fingers traced the edge of the wooden seat. Memories flooded back, one after another. Jungkook's laughter, the way he used to hum melodies unconsciously, the nights they would race each other back to the dorm just because they could, the way his hand always found Jimin's without effort. Jimin rested his forehead in his palms. It wasn't just about romance. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was about being left behind by someone who promised they'd always walk beside him, even when no words were spoken. Jungkook had been part of his rhythm, his silence, his chaos. Losing him felt like losing a part of his own reflection. And the worst part? He didn't even understand why. Days passed. Schedules resumed. The world kept spinning. But something inside Jimin remained paused, like a skipped beat in a song you couldn't unhear. He went through the motions. Interviews, rehearsals, smiles that didn't reach his eyes. Taehyung noticed first. Always sensitive to Jimin's energy, he didn't press with words, but his glances were weighted, concerned. One night, after a performance, he found Jimin lingering in the dressing room, alone, staring at the floor like it had all the answers. "He didn't mean to hurt you," Taehyung said softly, leaning against the doorway. His voice didn't hold judgment, only quiet understanding. Jimin didn't look up. "Then why does it feel like I was abandoned?" Taehyung hesitated. "Because maybe he didn't know how to say goodbye properly. Or maybe he hoped you would stop him." The silence between them ached. Jimin closed his eyes. I would have stopped him if he'd given me a chance. But chances, like people, slipped through fingers when not held tightly enough. Jungkook, on the other hand, kept to himself. No cryptic Instagram captions, no mentions, no updates that hinted at what he was thinking. Behind the scenes, he was quieter than usual, more focused. He showed up to every practice, hit every note, smiled for every camera, but those who had known him long enough noticed it. The smile didn't stay once the lens was gone. He didn't laugh with his whole chest anymore. He didn't linger after sessions. He left first, every time. Yoongi confronted him once in the studio. Not aggressively, just curiously. "You good?" he asked, pulling off his headphones as Jungkook adjusted the mic settings. Jungkook nodded. "Too fast, too rehearsed." Yoongi raised an eyebrow. "You sure? 'Cause you haven't really written anything lately. You used to bleed into your lyrics." Jungkook looked away, his jaw tensing. "I just don't feel like bleeding anymore." Yoongi didn't push, but the silence that followed said more than words could. There was a song Jungkook had been working on, unfinished, untitled. Just a rough melody and a few lyrics scribbled into a notepad he kept folded in his pocket. He played it late at night when no one was around. The chorus didn't come. It never did. It stopped at the bridge, like his heart had, that night with Jimin. He couldn't finish it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. One evening, while driving home, he passed by the cafe where they used to sit after vocal training. He parked without thinking, ordered the same drinks they used to, sat at the same booth. The seat across from him remained empty. He stared at it for a long time. People walked past. No one noticed the quiet man in the corner, his hands wrapped around a warm cup he didn't drink. There were so many things he wanted to say, but none of them felt right. Or maybe he was just afraid they wouldn't be enough. He had reasons, real ones. Things he never told Jimin about the pressures, the breakdowns he kept to himself, the fear of dragging someone down with him if he unraveled too far. He thought distancing himself was mercy. He thought letting go would protect Jimin. But now, he wasn't so sure. Maybe it was just cowardice disguised as care. Their paths crossed again weeks later, not by choice, but by work. A commercial shoot. Big brands, big cameras, bigger expectations. Everyone was buzzing, except them. Jimin arrived first, dressed in neutral tones, face calm, eyes unreadable. Jungkook walked in 10 minutes later. Their eyes met. No greeting, no tension, just emptiness. It was cruel, the way they had mastered pretending. They stood inches apart during group shots, smiling for lenses that didn't care about the distance between their hearts. At one point, their arms brushed. Neither flinched, neither reacted. But later, during break, Jimin stepped outside alone. The air was cold, crisp. His breath formed clouds as he exhaled. He leaned against the railing, arms folded tightly around himself. He didn't hear Jungkook approach until his shadow joined his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jungkook looked straight ahead. "Do you hate me now?" Jimin closed his eyes. "I don't think I can. But I'm still trying to understand." "I was scared," Jungkook admitted, voice low. "I thought letting go would hurt less than holding on and breaking apart later." Jimin laughed bitterly. You didn't let go. You disappeared. I didn't know what else to do. You could have talked to me. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Jimin whispered, I miss the version of you who used to sing to me at 2 a.m. without caring about pitch. Jungkook's throat tightened. I miss the version of us who didn't need to explain everything. Maybe we outgrew that version. Or maybe we just stopped trying to protect it. They stood there for another minute, the wind carrying words neither of them said. Then Jungkook turned to leave. Jimin didn't stop him. Neither did he call after him. Because maybe some moments were meant to stay unresolved. Maybe their last interaction wouldn't come with closure, or apologies, or full circle endings. Maybe some people are chapters, not endings. And maybe, just maybe, their silence spoke louder than any farewell. Under the same sky where their breath once synchronized under moonlight, Jimin walked the streets of Seoul with a quiet ache stitched into every step. The city no longer buzzed the same way, it was all too loud and too silent at once. Even the laughter of strangers felt like a mockery, a reminder that while the world continued spinning, his personal universe had cracked along its axis. He didn't talk about Jungkook to anyone, not to the staff, not even to Taehyung, who watched him closely from behind eyes that understood more than they ever said aloud. Jimin had mastered the art of pretending, smiling just right, performing perfectly, delivering the kind of polished presence the world expected of him. But inside, he carried a dissonant melody, one that no longer knew how to resolve itself. The studio became his sanctuary. Not the one they had once shared, the smaller one tucked into a quiet corner of the building, far from the echo of memories. There, Jimin started to write again, though his pen trembled more than it used to. Every lyric felt like it wanted to betray him, slipping into metaphors that bled with longing. He didn't write Jungkook's name. He didn't have to. It lived in every stanza, in every pause between beats, in every breath he exhaled when the silence became too much. He would stay until dawn sometimes, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, refusing to leave because outside meant reality. Inside meant pretending, maybe, just maybe, he could still feel the warmth of their laughter. The place remembered them, too. The way Jungkook would roll across the floor when his voice cracked mid-recording. The way they would collapse into laughter so loud it shook the walls. That memory was sacred, now untouchable. Elsewhere, Jungkook was moving. Always moving. Cities blurred into each other. Planes, hotels, press conferences. But wherever he went, Jimin's absence clung to him like smoke. He'd wake up in foreign cities and feel the urge to turn and say something silly, something small, and find no one beside him. He wasn't used to silence in his hotel rooms. Not after years of sharing space, stories, and midnight takeout. Now, the silence spoke louder than any comfort. He saw Jimin's face everywhere. In headlines, in LED advertisements towering above intersections, in the pause between songs, when the crowd roared his name. They hadn't blocked each other, but they didn't interact either. It was worse than hate. It was purgatory. There was a moment backstage at an awards show where they passed each other. Accidental, unscripted, a hallway too narrow, two people too familiar. Jimin looked up. Jungkook froze mid-step. Neither of them moved at first. Then Jimin gave the faintest nod. Polite, distant, civil. Jungkook's lips parted like he was going to say something, but the words fell back into his throat. What was there to say? That he still listened to their old demos just to hear Jimin's laughter in the background? That he sometimes caught himself humming their harmony when he thought no one could hear? That he wanted to start again but didn't know how to crawl back from where he left him? Jimin waited 2 seconds longer than necessary, then walked past. Their shoulders brushed nothing dramatic. just fabric, grazing fabric, but Jungkook felt it like a thunderclap. He turned around once Jimin had passed. Jimin didn't look back. That night, Jungkook didn't go to the after-party. He wandered the city instead. Hoodie pulled low, headphones in, but no music playing. He ended up at the place they once went after winning their first major award together, the old ramen shop. The neon sign still flickered. He went in, ordered the same thing, ate in silence. The owner didn't recognize him, maybe out of courtesy, maybe out of mercy. He was grateful either way. He thought of texting Jimin. Just, asterisk. Do you remember this place? Asterisk. But his fingers hovered, unmoving. He didn't send it. Across town, Jimin sat in his apartment, curled up on the couch, holding a mug he didn't drink from. He had watched the award show replay alone. The way Jungkook looked under those lights, confident, powerful, yet visibly tired. He still knew that look. He had soothed that look in quiet backstage corners when Jungkook burned himself out from perfectionism. Jimin had almost cried. Not because of the speech Jungkook gave, but because he didn't mention him. He wasn't entitled to it. He knew that, but it still felt like erasure, like he was being scrubbed from the narrative of someone he used to know better than himself. But the truth was Jungkook Times had Times written a version of the speech that included him. He just never read that draft. Neither of them were villains. They were just unfinished. One day, Namjoon invited them both to a gathering. Small. Just the members. No press. No cameras. Jimin hesitated before agreeing. Jungkook agreed immediately. The room was warm. Laughter. Easy. It was strange how they all fell into place like nothing had changed. But something had. Everyone felt it. The subtle shifts in energy when Jungkook entered the kitchen, and Jimin chose that moment to check his phone. The way Jungkook sat at the far end of the table. The way they didn't make eye contact unless someone else forced it. It wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. It was just fragile. Later, Taehyung found Jimin outside on the balcony, staring at the skyline. "You still love him, don't you?" Taehyung asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jimin's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "That's not the question that keeps me up at night." "Then what is?" Jimin looked up at the stars. "It's whether he ever loved me enough to stay." Taehyung didn't answer. Because that wasn't his answer to give. Inside, Jungkook stared at the empty spot Jimin had vacated. He wanted to follow. He wanted to say everything he had kept inside, but his feet wouldn't move. He had grown too used to hesitating. And maybe that was his greatest failure, not leaving. But never finding the courage to fight for what he had walked away from. Weeks later, they crossed paths at a charity performance. Only the two of them on the lineup. The audience didn't know, but the team backstage did. When Jimin stepped into the green room and saw Jungkook sitting there, tuning his guitar, the world stilled for a moment. Jungkook looked up. Jimin didn't turn around. He walked to the far end of the room, placed his jacket down, and sat. He didn't speak. Neither did Jungkook. Minutes passed. Then, without looking up, Jungkook spoke. "I still have the notebook." Jimin didn't respond, but his fingers clenched. "The one with our first lyrics," Jungkook continued. "I keep it in my backpack. Can't write in it anymore. Feels like it belongs to someone else." Jimin finally turned, voice soft but firm. "It belongs to who we were, not who we are." Jungkook nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess you're right." A pause. Then Jimin whispered, almost inaudibly, "Do you regret it?" Jungkook's eyes met his. "Every day." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. But it was something. The curtain call approached. The audience was loud, the moment ticking down. As they stood beside each other behind the stage, waiting for their names to be called, Jimin didn't look at Jungkook. But he said quietly, "This is probably the last time." Jungkook's breath caught. I know. Then let's sing it right. And they did. They walked out onto that stage, side by side. The crowd erupted. No one knew the weight of that silence between them. No one knew how every lyric was a goodbye. Their harmonies still blended perfectly, but it was their last. And when the lights faded and the applause echoed one last time, they walked in opposite directions, never looking back. The applause still echoed faintly in the hallway long after the stage lights dimmed. Jimin stood alone in the dressing room, the heavy silence pressing into his chest like a second skin. The applause, though loud and vibrant, had never sounded so hollow. The walls around him, bright white and sterile, reflected back the image of someone who had given everything and still walked away emptier than before. He glanced toward the mirror, saw himself not as the performer who had just received a standing ovation, but as the man who had just sung his final duet with someone he once believed would never leave. His hands trembled as he removed the earpiece from his right ear. He hadn't cried on stage, not this time, not even when the harmonies soared to the line that used to be their signature blend. But his voice had cracked, just a little. Enough for anyone paying attention to hear the weight behind it. It wasn't imperfection. It was truth, raw and irreversible. Behind the closed door across the hall, Jungkook sat with his head bowed over his knees, drenched in sweat and something far heavier. The adrenaline from the stage had faded, leaving only the ache of everything he hadn't said. He could still hear Jimin's voice beside his, could still feel how their tones collided and created something that once felt like destiny. But now, that sound belonged to the past. He didn't speak to anyone after the show. Not the makeup team. Not the event organizers. He left quietly, hoodie up, bag slung over one shoulder, disappearing into the night like a ghost too aware of his own haunting. Jimin remained longer. He didn't want to go home, because home wasn't what it used to be anymore. So he stayed until the staff began cleaning, until the buzz of celebration dulled into echoes of distant conversations. Eventually, he rose, dragging his duffel bag behind him, walking down a hallway he had memorized over the years. Each door, each light, each framed photo on the wall whispered fragments of his past memories, where Jungkook was always somewhere in the frame, whether laughing, teasing, or simply existing beside him. He exited through the back lot, just in time to see the taillights of Jungkook's car disappearing around the corner. There had been no goodbye. But there never was. Not really. What lingered now was an aftermath made of silence, of glances too brief, and words that trembled on the edge of being spoken but never dared to jump. The days that followed were gray, not in the sky, but in how time moved. Everything was muted. Colors didn't pop. Music didn't inspire. Jimin found himself waking up later, skipping meals, canceling on people who used to feel safe. He stared at his phone often, not to check messages, there were none, but to reread the old ones. The ones where Jungkook had once said things like, "Don't go to sleep yet," or, "I want to hear your voice." It hurt more because they hadn't even fought. There was no dramatic explosion, no irreversible betrayal, just a series of quiet choices that slowly created distance until it became unbearable. The fans noticed.
They always did. Edits started to circulate old moments, glances during concerts, behind-the-scenes clips where their laughter felt endless. Why did it stop? One comment asked. They were each other's comfort, wrote another. Jimin read them sometimes, his thumb hovering over the screen, wondering how strangers could understand something he could barely put into words himself. Jungkook stayed silent online. No updates. No vague captions. Just absence. Even the members felt it. Hoseok reached out. Namjoon tried to call, but neither of them asked directly. They respected the invisible line drawn in the aftermath of something so private it couldn't be explained in group chats or over coffee. Taehyung, however, remained closest. He didn't talk about it. He just sat beside Jimin more often than usual, sometimes in total silence. And that helped more than any words could. One night Jimin found himself at the Han River again, the same bench, the same view, but this time it wasn't raining. The air was still and painfully clear. He brought a small notepad, the kind he used to use when lyrics came to him like breathing. He opened to a blank page and wrote a line. Some songs aren't meant for the stage. They're meant to be heard by the person who left. He didn't write another word. He tore the page out, folded it, slipped it into his pocket. Then he closed the book and stood up, not looking back. Meanwhile, Jungkook had begun recording alone again, not for a comeback, not for release, just to feel something again. He sat in his home studio, surrounded by shadows and the low glow of LED lights, headphones resting around his neck. The lyrics came slowly, fragments, phrases that hurt to sing. There was one line he kept repeating. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I cared too much. He never wrote it down. He just sang it into the void. The void didn't answer. Weeks passed. And then something strange happened. They both found themselves scheduled for a joint interview, not directly together, but as part of a group reunion shoot. One room, one camera, multiple artists. They hadn't requested it. The management hadn't mentioned it, perhaps thinking it wouldn't matter, or perhaps hopping it would force resolution. When Jimin saw Jungkook walk into the green room, dressed in black, eyes unreadable, something inside him braced. Jungkook's eyes met his. There was no shock, just awareness. They sat on opposite sides. The others filled the space with chatter. But Jimin felt the silence between them grow louder with every minute. When the camera began to roll, they became professionals. Smiles, jokes, rehearsed anecdotes. But at one point the interviewer asked, "What's one thing you wish you could say to someone, even if they're sitting in this room?" The question hung in the air. Jungkook's gaze flickered briefly, so did Jimin's. No one answered. The silence was telling. Too loud, too honest. After the shoot, as everyone began packing up, Jimin approached the hallway alone. His footsteps echoed. Then, "I wasn't brave enough," came a voice behind him. He turned. Jungkook stood there, his expression raw. "I thought pulling away would make it easier for you," he continued. "But all it did was make me lose the one person who saw me, even when I didn't want to be seen." Jimin stared at him, his throat tightened. "Why now?" Jungkook took a step closer. "Because if I don't say it now, I'll carry it forever." Jimin looked down, then back up. "You already are." Another pause. Then Jungkook whispered, "Do you still hear our harmony when you sing alone?" Jimin's voice was barely a breath, every time. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. But for the first time they stood still, together in the same memory, the same pain. And maybe that was enough. Not to fix it. Not to return to what was. But to acknowledge it mattered. That what they shared existed. That it shaped them. That even if the last interaction left many questions, it had once held all the answers. Under the muted glow of the studio corridor lights, they lingered for a moment that felt suspended outside of time, neither past nor present, neither close nor distant. The hallway around them was empty now, crew long gone, echoes long faded, and yet the air remained saturated with everything unsaid between them. Jungkook's hand twitched slightly at his side, as if it ached to reach for something, someone, that was no longer his to hold. Jimin, standing just a few steps away, didn't move either, his gaze steady, not hard but filled with something much more devastating than anger, clarity. For so long, the pain between them had been tangled in confusion, in unspoken words, in passive choices mistaken as protection. But now, with all the chaos quieted, only the truth remained. They were no longer fighting the storm. They were standing in the aftermath, facing what was left. "You always thought disappearing would keep me from falling apart," Jimin said softly, his voice not bitter, just exhausted. But what you never understood is, you were the only thing keeping me together. Jungkook swallowed, but the lump in his throat refused to move. I thought I was protecting you. You weren't. Jimin's words hung between them like broken glass. You were protecting yourself from the guilt of staying, from the weight of being loved by someone you couldn't promise forever to. I wanted to be better for you. But I never asked you to be better, Jimin cut in, the first real flare of emotion in his tone. I just asked you to be there. Silence pressed in again, thick and unforgiving. Jungkook stepped forward slightly, but Jimin didn't close the gap. There had been too many steps missed between them already. You were my anchor, Jungkook murmured, and I thought if I dragged you with me while I drowned, I'd hate myself. Jimin's eyes glistened in the dim hallway light. And now, I'm just someone you let go to save yourself. Jungkook opened his mouth, but nothing came. What could he say to undo the months of absence, the hesitation, the moments where he should have said something and chose silence instead? The truth was, there were no right words anymore. Not to fix what they were, not to rewind the clock, not to return to the boyish comfort of stolen glances and soft laughter beneath practice room lights. They had outgrown that version of themselves, and all that remained were fragments, shimmering but sharp. Jimin exhaled deeply, and in that breath was resignation, not to bitterness but to acceptance. Some people leave without doors slamming, he whispered. Just footsteps, so quiet you don't hear them until it's too late. And with that he walked past Jungkook, not fast, not dramatic, just final. Jungkook didn't follow. He stood there, eyes on the floor, the weight of goodbye heavier now than it had ever been in all the months they spent apart. But life didn't pause for heartbreak. Not in their world. The cameras came again, the interviews, the rehearsals, the smiles, and they learned to exist in the same orbit without colliding, professionally seamless, emotionally estranged. Fans speculated, of course. They always did. Some saw the distance in their body language. Others clung to the idea of slow burn reunion. But only they knew the truth. They weren't angry. They were just unfinished. Jimin found solace in music again. Not the way he used to. Not in love songs or harmonies meant to intertwine, but in solitude. In raw, stripped-down piano notes that sounded more like sighs than melodies. His next solo track wasn't about heartbreak. It was about standing alone, about finding yourself in the silence left behind by someone who used to be your echo. Jungkook heard it, of course. He didn't say anything publicly, but he listened to it on loop one night, lying on the floor of his studio with the lights off, the world dimmed to nothing but Jimin's voice in his ears. It wasn't a diss track. It wasn't a cry for sympathy. It was honest. And honesty hurt more than blame. He tried to write something back, picked up his guitar, laid down the first few chords, but everything that came out felt wrong, either too careful or too confessional, so he stopped. Let the strings fall quiet. Sometimes silence was a song too. Months passed. Jimin traveled, found new sounds, worked with new artists. He smiled more, laughed more. But those who truly knew him could see the difference. His joy was lighter now, but never as full, as if something once sacred had been folded away, preserved somewhere unreachable. Jungkook focused on visuals, directing, producing, disappearing behind the camera lens instead of standing in front of it. He poured himself into angles and lighting, into telling other people's stories because his own felt too raw to touch. They saw each other at award shows, at airports, at meetings. Always polite. Always cordial. Never the same. Until one day, during a charity gala, they were asked to present an award together. They stood backstage once again, side by side, dressed in black, microphones clipped, hearts steady but distant. Jimin glanced over, just once. Do you still remember the first time we stood together on a stage? Jungkook's lips curved into the faintest smile. You forgot your lines. And you covered for me without missing a beat, Jimin said, the corner of his mouth twitching with the memory. I remember thinking I could stand beside you forever. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was full. Jimin looked at him carefully, and now. Jungkook's gaze didn't waver. Now I'm just grateful I ever got to. Their cue came. They stepped out beneath the lights. Two professionals. Two people with a past too deep to erase, and a bond too quiet to define. As the audience applauded, they handed over the award and bowed in sync. And in that single gesture, there was a trace of the old rhythm, a flash of what had once been effortless. They left the stage without fanfare. Later that night, Jungkook passed by Jimin in the hotel lobby. Neither of them spoke, but as they crossed, Jungkook slipped something into Jimin's palm. It was folded paper. Jimin waited until he was alone to open it. It was the page from their old lyric notebook, the one Jimin had thought lost. His handwriting still lingered across the top in faint pencil strokes, but beneath it, Jungkook had added a final line. I didn't know how to stay, but I never truly left. Jimin folded it slowly, pressing it to his chest. He didn't call, didn't text, but he walked to the piano that night and played the first melody he had written in months. Not to move on, but to remember. Not every story ends with closure. Some end with memory, some with music, and some with a single note left hanging, unfinished but eternal. Of course, here's the continuation of the story, written in long-form immersive English prose, uninterrupted, emotionally layered and cinematic in tone, following directly from the last moment with the lyric note and the quiet piano melody. The melody started gently, hesitant fingers on ivory keys, like a voice relearning how to speak. Jimin's apartment was dark except for the single lamp near the piano, its golden hue casting a warm circle over the sheetless stand. He wasn't reading music. There were no lyrics written this time, no structured bars or clean transitions. He was improvising from emotion alone, letting the weight of that folded paper resting near his elbow guide every note. Outside, the Seoul skyline blinked in scattered lights, windows like tiny stars. But inside, it was all stillness and sound, a fragile kind of quiet that exists only when grief and love intertwine in harmony. The paper with Jungkook's line, I didn't know how to stay, but I never truly left sat beside a candle that had long burned out. He didn't need to unfold it again. He knew the words by heart now, the curve of each letter, the exact smudge of pencil that lingered beside Jungkook's final stroke. Jimin let his eyes close as his hands moved across the keys. He wasn't trying to finish a song. He wasn't trying to send a message. For once, he wasn't even thinking about the audience. This moment was for no one else but him, and the echo of someone he had loved quietly, wholly, and still did, despite it all. The sound swelled, then dropped, dipping into a minor chord. The ache in the music mirrored the ache in his chest. It wasn't sharp like it once had been. It was dull now, like a scar just under the skin, familiar, persistent, a reminder of something that had changed him. He didn't cry, not anymore. The tears had come in silence, in hotel bathrooms, in late-night taxis, and empty practice rooms. This was different. This was release. When the last note faded into the stillness, he let his fingers rest on the keys a moment longer than necessary. His breath was slow, even, but inside he was a storm held in check only by the rhythm of remembering. He rose, folded the note again with practiced tenderness, and placed it into the back of the lyric book that had once been theirs. Then he closed it. He didn't lock it away, just left it on the shelf where it could be found if needed, but didn't beg to be opened. Elsewhere, Jungkook lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling like it held constellations only he could see. He hadn't slept in over a day. The hotel room was quiet except for the low hum of the fridge and the occasional groan of distant elevators. The city outside pulsed with life, but his world was confined to the echo of what he had done and what he hadn't. He kept thinking about Jimin's face when he read the note. He didn't see it, but he imagined it, 1,000 times. He imagined the way Jimin's lips would tighten slightly, the way his lashes would lower, the way his hand would brush over the words like they might fade if not touched. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't even expect a reply. He just wanted Jimin to know. Because that was what he should have said all those months ago, when everything was starting to crumble and neither of them could admit it. When the silences became louder than the music, and the spaces between them stretched until they didn't know how to return. Now he wasn't trying to go back. He just didn't want to be erased. He rolled onto his side, eyes falling on the guitar resting beside the bed. It still wore the same strings from their last recording together, the same sticker Jimin had put on the neck as a joke, a tiny cartoon moon with sleepy eyes. He reached for it, cradling it with reverence, fingers ghosting over the strings. And without thinking, he began to play. It wasn't loud, it wasn't polished, but it was honest. Each chord felt like a confession, each pause a breath he'd held too long. He recorded it on his phone, just a voice memo. No edits, no harmonies, just his voice slightly hoarse, slightly tired, singing words that didn't rhyme but carried truth. If I could go back, I'd stand still. If I could speak, I'd be quiet first. If I could love you again, I'd love you softer. Not less, just softer. He didn't send it, but the phone saved it. In a folder he never labeled. In a place he might return to, or might never open again. Time passed differently after that. The seasons shifted. Projects changed. Both of them moved forward, not in leaps but in quiet steps, like walking through fog. You don't know how far you've gone until you look behind you. They didn't see each other for months. Not by design, just by distance. Jimin flew to Paris for a fashion campaign. Jungkook disappeared into a recording retreat with producers up in the mountains. But even in separation, there were signs. Fans noticed that they still used the same emoji in unrelated captions. That they both quoted the same poem weeks apart. That they still followed the same obscure photographer's account. It was nothing, and it was everything. Eventually, one day in spring, they stood on the same stage again. Not to perform, just as guests. A tribute event, a memorial for a senior artist who had once mentored them both. They arrived separately, sat in the same row, and when the moment came to speak, they stood together, reading from the same page. They didn't look at each other, but their voices blended as they always had. When the ceremony ended, Jimin stepped outside for air. The garden was quiet. A soft breeze danced through the cherry blossoms, petals falling like gentle reminders that some things end beautifully. Jungkook appeared beside him, not suddenly but naturally. They stood in silence again. But this time it did ache. It settled, like two puzzle pieces that didn't need to fit anymore to still belong in the same box. Jungkook didn't speak at first. Then quietly, "Did you ever finish that song, the one you played that night?" Jimin nodded. "It's not for anyone else." "I know," Jungkook said, "but I'm glad you wrote it anyway." Jimin looked at him, eyes softer now. "Did you ever send that voice memo?" "No," Jungkook answered, "but I still remember every word." And then for the first time in a long time, Jimin smiled. Not out of joy, not out of nostalgia, but out of peace. Some stories don't need endings to matter. Some people leave and still remain. And some harmonies linger long after the music fades. That spring evening lingered in their minds far longer than it should have. There was no promise made, no conversation drawn beyond the gentle exchange about unwritten songs and voice memos never sent. Yet something shifted quietly in the air between them, a faint recalibration, a recognition not of what they had been, but of what they still were, despite the ruin, the silence, the time. Jimin returned to his apartment that night to find the scent of rain already fatting from the open window. He didn't close it. He let the city drift in, the sirens, the tires splashing through puddles, the laughter of strangers echoing far below. He sat on the edge of the couch with his jacket still on and played the memory of that moment in the garden over again. Jungkook standing beside him, their words few but genuine, the space between them neither too close nor too far. It was the first time in a long while that Jimin didn't ache afterward. Instead, he felt something different. Not relief, not closure, but maybe a quiet release. Meanwhile, across the river, Jungkook stood by his bedroom window with the lights off. The garden lights from the memorial event still burned faintly in his mind, the way the petals drifted down from the cherry trees like falling memories. He didn't regret speaking to Jimin. If anything, he regretted how long it had taken to speak again. He lay on his bed, headphones on, that old voice memo from months ago playing just once, like a whisper from a version of himself that no longer existed. He didn't cry. He didn't pause. He just listened, because sometimes moving forward required hearing yourself at your most vulnerable and not turning away. Over the following weeks, their paths didn't cross often, but when they did, at events, at studios, at meetings with overlapping management, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it wasn't tension either. It was something more grounded. Something still scarred, still tender, but honest. Yoongi noticed it first during a rehearsal. They were preparing a special reunion stage for a charity concert, and the original lineup, without adjustments, meant Jimin and Jungkook would be singing side by side again. The staff had asked if it needed to be restructured. Neither of them said no. On the day of the rehearsal, Jungkook arrived first, quiet as always, hoodie pulled over his head. He stayed near the back of the studio, stretching in silence. Jimin walked in 20 minutes later, nodding at a few familiar faces before finding his space. The first notes of the old track echoed through the room. Jimin's voice entered first. Jungkook followed on the harmony. And for a breathless moment, everything that had fractured between them held together in the music. No one spoke afterward, no one needed to. They didn't hug, didn't linger, just nodded at each other, a silent agreement that whatever they were now, it was enough to stand on the same stage again. The night of the concert arrived fast. Jimin stood backstage, nerves tight but not overwhelming. He wasn't anxious about the performance, he knew they would do well. He was anxious about the weight of it, the memory, the significance. Their last real duet had been a goodbye dressed as harmony. This one wasn't a reunion. It was something else. Jungkook joined him moments before the cue. He looked calm, steady, but in his eyes Jimin saw the same mirror of memory. "You ready?" Jungkook asked softly. Jimin nodded. "You?" Jungkook hesitated. "Yeah, this time I think I am." When they stepped into the spotlight, the crowd erupted. The lights dimmed to deep violet, casting soft glows across their silhouettes. The track began, and the room filled with that familiar blend of piano and heartbeat. And when they sang, it wasn't for the audience. Not really. It was for the space between them, for the echoes, for the night on the rooftop they never talked about, for the phone call Jungkook never made, for the text Jimin never sent, for the time they lost and the silence they survived. It wasn't perfect. Their voices cracked in places. They didn't look at each other much. But it was real. And when the final note rang out and the lights dimmed, they stood still for just a second longer than they needed to. Enough for anyone watching closely to wonder. They walked off stage together. Not speaking, but side by side. Later in the green room, Jimin sat alone for a while. The afterglow of performing still hummed beneath his skin. He thought about saying something to Jungkook, about thanking him for the professionalism, maybe even for the courage. But before he could move, Jungkook entered, a towel slung over his neck, hair damp from sweat. Their eyes met. "You sang it differently this time," Jungkook said, sitting across from him. Jimin shrugged slightly. "I meant it differently this time." Jungkook nodded. "Me too." Another pause, but it didn't stretch awkwardly. Then Jungkook reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook. He handed it over. Jimin blinked. "What's this?" Jungkook looked away for a moment, then back. "Lyrics, half finished, from last year. I didn't know if I'd ever finish them, but they always felt like hours." Jimin opened it slowly, the pages filled with scratchy handwriting, crossed out lines, sudden bursts of vulnerability. And yes, he saw it immediately. These weren't solo songs. These were echoes of a time they hadn't known how to hold onto, chords that waited for harmonies, stories that waited for two voices to tell. "I thought I'd ruined everything," Jungkook said quietly. "But maybe some things don't get ruined. They just change shape." Jimin closed the book gently. "Maybe." They didn't make plans. Didn't talk about collaborating again. But when Jimin left the room that night, he tucked the notebook under his arm. Days passed. Then weeks. And slowly the distance they had once treated like a shield became something else. Space, yes, but space that allowed breathing, space that allowed healing. They messaged sometimes. Short, casual, sometimes not about anything at all, just an emoji. A picture of a lyric scribbled on a napkin, a piano chord, a sky they knew the other would find beautiful. It wasn't what they used to have. It wasn't trying to be. It was something honest. And honesty, after all the pretending, felt like peace. Eventually, the conversations became longer. One night, Jimin sent a voice memo. Just 3 seconds. A melody. Jungkook replied with one of his own. No words, just music. And in that moment, though they were in different cities, different beds, different lives, they weren't apart. They were still writing. Still breathing the same song. Still proving that not every last interaction ends in silence. Some evolve. Some endure. And some become a quiet promise. Even if the story changes, the connection doesn't have to die with it. It just finds another way to live. The melody lingered in the quiet of the night, dancing gently between spaces that once held silence too heavy to breathe through. Jimin sat on the floor of his living room, legs folded beneath him, phone resting beside a half-finished cup of tea. He replayed Jungkook's voice memo once more, not because he needed to, but because something about the way Jungkook ended the phrase, with that slight exhale and unresolved note, made Jimin feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Hope. Not the reckless kind that burns too fast and leaves nothing behind, but the slow, quiet kind that builds in layers. Trust rebuilt not through grand gestures but through consistency, through presence, through unfinished melodies that still invite harmony. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. There was a patience now between them, the kind that only exists after you've lost someone and found the courage to face them again, not with demands or expectations, but with understanding. The kind of patience that knows timing is delicate, and some things only bloom again if left untouched long enough to find their own way back to light. Jungkook on the other side of the city lay sprawled across his studio couch, guitar cradled to his chest like a heartbeat. His phone sat on the floor beside him, the blue light of the screen dimmed but still glowing faintly against the wall. He hadn't meant for that memo to carry so much, hadn't expected it to feel so intimate, but it had. And when he closed his eyes now, he could hear Jimin's soft breathing in the silence before the reply. He didn't know what this was. He wasn't sure what they were building, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't afraid to find out. The next morning, Jimin went to the studio. Not the company one. The small room he'd been renting quietly, a tucked-away space 3 floors above a bookstore in Mappo. No signs. No polished equipment, just a keyboard, a dusty mic, and walls that didn't echo judgment. He played the memo from Jungkook again, and let it guide his fingers. It was simple, a minor progression, a slight crescendo, nothing theatrical, but it felt like breath, like beginning, like something old that refused to stay buried. He recorded over it softly, just his voice humming a counter-melody, tentative at first, then braver with each pass. It wasn't a song yet. It wasn't even a demo, but it was a conversation, and that was enough. When he sent it, he didn't say anything in the message. Just the file. Jungkook opened it immediately, then listened to it again. And again. And for the first time in months, he smiled with something that reached his eyes. Not because it meant they were back to what they once were, but because it meant they were still here. Still finding language in music. Still building bridges across silence. What followed wasn't linear. There were days they didn't talk, times when life and obligations and their own hesitations pulled them into separate orbits again. But something had been restored. Not the old dynamic, not the shared coffees at dawn or the hands brushing during choreography or the laughter in dressing rooms, but something deeper. Respect. Trust. An invisible thread pulled taut between them, not asking for anything but refusing to break. They continued to send music. Bits and pieces. Rough ideas. Unfinished verses. Sometimes just a single note or lyric scribbled into a phone's memo pad. They didn't say they were working on a song together. They didn't say what it meant. But slowly, over weeks, something took shape. A shared folder appeared. Then a rough title, For Now. No capital letters, no punctuation, just those words. For now. It said everything. They weren't promising forever. They weren't undoing the past. But they were here. Now. And that was enough. The first real studio session happened one rainy afternoon in early summer. Jungkook had booked a private space, simple, familiar, and sent Jimin the location without a word. When Jimin walked in, Jungkook was already seated, headphones on, plucking at chords. He looked up when the door opened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Jungkook offered a small, sincere smile. Jimin returned it. And just like that, they began. No dramatic reunions, no awkward small talk. Just music. The hours passed quickly. They experimented, laughed softly at missed notes, argued gently about bridges and tempo, and somewhere between dusk and midnight, the room was filled with something unspoken but full. They didn't touch. They didn't reminisce. But their harmonies came back like they'd never left. Layer by layer, they built the song. It wasn't about love. Not directly. It wasn't about heartbreak either. It was about timing. About spaces that used to hurt, now becoming places to grow. About saying what couldn't be said back then, through chords and melodies now. About being brave enough to admit, we couldn't stay then, but we're trying now. The final chorus ended in a suspended note, neither resolved nor broken. When they listened to it back, sitting side by side in the small sound booth, neither of them spoke until the track faded to silence. Then Jimin whispered, "I never thought we'd sing together again." Jungkook turned to him, expression unreadable but tender. "I didn't think we had anything left to say." Jimin looked ahead again. "Turns out, we just needed a different language." Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, something else had finally begun. In the following weeks, they kept it quiet. No posts. No hints. It wasn't for fans yet. It wasn't for the company. It wasn't even for the charts. It was for them. A gift, a record, a reminder. Of what they'd lost. Of what they found again. Of what happens when you stop running from unfinished stories and choose instead to write a new chapter. They finished the song just before autumn. They didn't give it a grand name. Just For Now, as it always was. And when the time came to perform it on a quiet stage, for a small benefit event, far from the flashing lights and screaming crowds, they stood beside each other once again. No scripts, no choreography, just two voices, one song, and a silence between verses that no longer hurt. They didn't say what it was about. They didn't need to, because some stories don't need to be explained. Some just need to be sung.